On the 13th of May in 1946, Joseph Stalin signed into ordinance a decree establishing a special committee for reactive technology, a committee that would serve as a major catalyst for improvements in global technologies, the growth of a Soviet and Russian culture, and the emergence of a new standard for global competition and cooperation. Since before written history, mankind has looked to the stars. Every culture throughout history has shared the practice of astronomy, the ultimate gateway science. Some writers and scientific postulators throughout time have deigned to imagine space travel, but all attempts to prophesy man's travel to space were eclipsed by the writings of Konstantin Tsiolkovsky. Tsiolkovsky wrote several books proposing ideas for metal aerodynamic aircraft, space colonization, and most importantly, jet propulsion. His publishing of Exploration of the World Space with Reaction Machines in 1903 and other following works came to be recognized as the first scientifically sound proposals for using rockets to explore space. In these works, he first devised Tsiolkovsky's formula, a rocket equation that would serve as the base for the study of astronautics. Then came the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, and a new focus was placed on the industry and technological progress of the new Soviet Union. In 1921, an upcoming rocket scientist, Nikolai Tikhomirov, established the Gas Dynamics Laboratory, or GDL, which was the first government-sponsored program studying how a rocket engine could fly in the vacuum of space. In this laboratory, Tikhomirov began working with Valentin Petrovich Glushko, a future designer of Soviet rocket engines. The GDL expanded from a staff of 10 to 200 in 5 years, continuing work based on Tsiolkovsky's writing. Another group was formed by the famous Sergei Korolev, who would prove to be the leading designer of rocket technology in the post-war Soviet space program. This group was known as the Group for the Study of Reactive Propulsion, or GIRD. Korolev and his team of rocket scientists performed successful tests for the Soviet government, even launching a rocket that carried a balloon to an altitude of 19 kilometers, a world record at the time. Most of this work was used to benefit the Red Army. However, in 1937, Joseph Stalin began mass executions of intellectuals and military officials. Many were sent to camps or placed under house arrest. Some of the Soviet Union's finest rocket scientists were counted in these numbers, including Korolev and Glushko, until they were released in 1941 to design aircraft and rocketry for World War II.
Friends of mine in Russia have tried to trace down what happened to these people, and without much success.
The military competition for rocketry design sparked a movement that would change Soviet technology, culture, and international relations forever. On May 13, 1946, Joseph Stalin established a special committee for reactive technology, the first post-war rocket program which would lead the charge in the space race and change the world. Initially, the program studied the rocketry of the German military, redesigning the German A-4 rocket to make the R-1 and R-2 rockets. Then, in 1953, the Soviets tested the R-5, a totally new design with which they launched animals. Following the design of the R-5, Korolev and Glushko began to recognize the value of the design and launch of a satellite that would orbit the Earth. These ambitions were supported by the new Soviet leadership of Nikita Khrushchev, who gave Korolev the permissions needed to design and launch the R-7 rocket, most famous for its launch of Sputnik 1, the Earth satellite with which the Soviets won the space race.
Today, a new moon is in the sky, a 23-inch metal sphere placed in orbit by a Russian rocket. You are hearing the actual signals transmitted by the Earth-circling satellite, one of the great scientific feats of the age.
On October 4, 1957, Korolev successfully launched Sputnik 1 into orbit, a feat which shocked the world. Thus came the first of the Soviet Union's space firsts, and with the sudden international recognition of the space program came steadily increasing nationalistic pride and a completely novel space culture.
Until 2 days ago, that sound had never been heard on this earth. Suddenly, it has become as much a part of 20th century life as the whir of your vacuum cleaner.
Representations of rocketry and space became appearing in government propaganda, artwork, literature, and film, even covering stamps and matchboxes. Several weeks later, Sputnik 2 was launched, carrying the first animal, a dog named Laika, into space. These surprising Russian developments propelled other international identities to push more support to their space programs. As the United States program prepared to launch its first reactionary satellite, the Soviets then proceeded to launch Sputnik 3, a satellite the weight of which reached 1.5 tons, 1,000 times that of NASA's Explorer.
There are some instances where you may be ahead of us. For example, in the development of the thrust of your rockets for the investigation of outer space. There may be some instances, for example, color television, where we're ahead of you. But in order for both of us to benefit, you see, you never concede anything.
At the 1958 World's Fair in Brussels, Sputnik 3 became a primary focus of the Soviet pavilion and was a powerful display of the influence of its space program. Before long, the Soviets were designing spacecraft with the purpose of traveling to the moon and beyond. In 1959, the Luna 1 spacecraft became the first to reach the moon, and then, in 1962, the Soviets sent the first spaceship to Mars during the Mars 1 mission. After the launch of Luna 1, the Soviets began designing the Vostok program, a series of new rockets designed to put humans into Earth orbit. In 1960, Vostok 1 carried the dogs Belka and Strelka into space and returned them, the first animals to be retrieved from Earth orbit. Then, the following year, after testing a number of highly qualified fighter jet pilots, Yuri Gagarin was chosen as the first cosmonaut, and on April 12, 1961, became the first man in space. The success of the Soviet manned space program had an incredible effect on Soviet culture. Cosmonauts were idealized as heroes. Their lives were fully and carefully publicized as they became living examples of Soviet power. They became a fantastic tool of the communist movement's attempt to create a new man, or Novyi Человек. They were portrayed as perfect followers of the moral code of the builder of communism, which described 12 rules that defined acceptable manners. The next of the Soviet space firsts came with the first woman in space, the cosmonaut Valentina Tereshkova in 1963 on board the Vostok 5 rocket. She remained in orbit for a full 3 days, which at the time was longer than the time spent in space by all American astronauts combined. Then, in 1964, Korolev expanded the space program even more by designing the Voskhod spacecraft, which accommodated 3 cosmonauts, and in the same year became the first mission to carry multiple persons into orbit in the same spacecraft. In 1965, the Soviets became the first to complete a spacewalk, represented by cosmonaut Alexei Leonov on the second of the Voskhod missions. The spacewalk was televised globally, and the Soviets asserted their continuing supremacy over space technologies. In 1971, they chased down yet another space first with Salyut 1, the first orbital space station. However, the Salyut program was not entirely effective, and was most important in its supplementary role to the construction of the Mir space station. The Mir space station was an incredible representation of shifts in global attitudes during the space age. 2 years after Mir was built as a replacement for Salyut, it accepted Bulgarian and Afghan cosmonauts, and later a Frenchman who would become the first non-American and non-Soviet man to complete a spacewalk. Then, following the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, Mir was the center of international cooperation and remained operational until 15 years after its construction. Following the 1960s, the United States National Aeronautics and Space Administration surfaced as an equally powerful space force as the Soviet space program. However, the organization that started it all was the Soviet program, beginning with the Special Committee for Reactive Technology created by Joseph Stalin in 1946. With the power of the Soviet space program came a sense of burgeoning national pride, reflected in the media, art, and even commercial products in the Soviet Union. These cultural repercussions were significantly enduring, and even have an influence on Russian culture today, where space exploration is still very important. But the legacy of the Soviet space program is not only carried on in its local influences on culture, but also its incredible technological advancements with its series of space firsts, transforming it from a country of technological deficiency to one of technological power. The work of the Soviet space program was the first step in the space race, an international competition that drove the world into the modern era. All of this can be traced back to the single moment, the single turning point, in which Joseph Stalin signed a decree establishing the Special Committee for Reactive Technology on May 13, 1946.